Okay. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Mason Ameri, who will be serving as our presenter. First, a big thank you to Mason for joining us, and I'll tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Mason Ameri studies disability employment and has developed evidence-based solutions to improve the inclusion of people with disabilities in organizations and society. He has published widely in high-impact journals and has been featured in popular press, including several New York Times exclusives. His talks for TEDx, the World Bank Group, and other platforms have driven discussions on promoting accessibility. Mason has consulted with various public and private entities on policy reform, such as the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. He has helped secure nearly $12 million in grants from NSF, MIT, HHS, and EAC to operate a wave of innovative disability research. Mason has received several noteworthy recognitions, including multiple Dean's Meritorious Honors, the Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Provost Award for Excellence in Teaching Innovations, and Poets and Quant's Best 40 Under 40 MBA Professors. He is humble, kind, and dedicated. There's so much that you can learn from Mason. So with that, I'll hand things over so he can get started. Thank you, Mason.
Thank you so much for having me. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everyone's doing well. Good to virtually meet you. Like Margaret had mentioned earlier on, today's discussion really includes some insights from my research on disability employment that I'm glad to share with you in the interest of raising more awareness of our DEI playbook at work and the attention that perhaps needs to be paid toward accessibility to that end in that scheme. Now, on the docket today, we're going to touch on three main areas. First and foremost, I want to set the stage with some basic stats on the disability employment gap, as well as stress a big driver behind that gap. This is followed by some interview insights on the disability disclosure dilemma, impression management, the use of assistive technology in controlling for productivity constraints, and self-advocacy, the art of how people with disabilities can best communicate their needs with employers. Finally, we're going to touch on the company side of things in this equation and what they can do to ensure their workforce is a place of belonging, including how they signal this through job ads, through their environment internally, but also how they ensure DEI sustainability. So starting off, I think it comes as no surprise for some of us who are familiar with the literature on disability that this population's economic well-being has been and continues to be an elusive goal. Case in point, in reviewing the Bureau of Labor Statistics employment rates of last year, the percentage of the US population with disabilities that are employed was 21.3%, in comparison to their non-disabled counterparts, whose percentage was 65.4%. Now, that's a pretty huge gap. And the same is true of the unemployment rate here in the States, which is to say that the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed was 7.6% for people with disabilities and 3.5% for those without disabilities. Now, in taking this journey back to 2019, at this point, the employment landscape looked like this. About 19.3% of people with disabilities were employed, compared to 66.3% of people without disabilities. Fast forward to 2020, a year that needs really no introduction. The pandemic hit, and it hit really hard. Employment rates took a dive across the board, but for people with disabilities, especially, the rate dropped to 17.9%. So the gains made from 2019 and back were virtually lost. Then comes 2021, a year of resilience and recovery. And we saw that the employment rate for people with disabilities bounced back to 19.1%. Many attribute this to tight labor markets and the advantage of remote work opportunities. I call this a total game changer. And this upward trend has only continued as of 2022. The employment rate for people with disabilities reached a high of 21.3%. So I bring these statistics before you. Why? Because the takeaway here is that despite the challenges and setbacks, this group's employment rate has shown a promising upward trend. But there's a but. The gap between the employment rates for those with and without disabilities is still relatively significant. And it begs the question, why? The short answer is stigma. Despite being in a world where the DEI rhetoric among companies, amongst ourselves, is at a roaring high, we still have this pain point. Imagine you're an employer. I suspect many people attending right now are employers or middle managers or executives. You have a business to run, and you need a team that can help you achieve your goals. Now, let's talk about some of those perceptions that might come up when considering hiring people with disabilities. First, there's a concern about productivity. Some employers might worry that people with disabilities won't be as productive as their counterparts. Then there's the issue of absenteeism. The fear is that people with disabilities might need more time off, affecting the workflow and output of the team. Increased supervision is yet another concern. Employers might believe that employees with disabilities require more guidance, more oversight, which could strain managerial resources. Litigation fears also come into play. Employers might worry about potential legal issues that could arise when employing people with disabilities. Next comes the question of coworker treatment. How will other employees react? Will they be supportive, or could there be friction? And of course, there's the cost of accommodations. Making the workplace accessible and comfortable for all employees is mission critical, but it can come with additional expenses. All of this to say that there's the human aspect of unfamiliarity, and I want to stress that word, where people tend to be wary of what they don't know. If an employer or a team has had little experience or contact with people with disabilities, there might be a natural aversion simply due to a lack of understanding that leads to these types of questions or these types of concerns, most of which are unfounded. And these perceptions can create barriers to employment for people with disabilities, but also it precludes people with disabilities from self-identifying and disclosing their need for accommodations. Disability disclosure in the workplace is a personal decision that is pretty complex. And the reason why is because those perceptions that we just talked about earlier, they create a sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. On the one hand, if an employee discloses their disability, they might fear being viewed through the lens of those misconceptions. They could worry about being seen as less productive, needing more supervision, or causing extra costs for accommodation. On the other hand, if they choose not to disclose, they might miss out on necessary accommodations that could enhance their work performance and comfort above all. Plus, they might constantly feel the pressure of keeping a part of their identity hidden. And yet employers prefer people with disabilities to disclose due to integrity. So the question then becomes to disclose or not to disclose. And the answer is it's complicated. There's mixed evidence out there in the literature, out there in the field on best practices. And what I mean to say is, imagine you're standing at a crossroads. One path is labeled disclosure, the other non-disclosure. It's a tough decision, just given all that we've discussed, and I suspect for some of us personally, it's a reality. On the non-disclosure path, you might think to yourself, let's avoid the conversation, land the job first, and protect yourself, right? It's a valid thought supported by several studies. The big concern being you don't want your disability to overshadow your skills and qualifications because of the stigma that's attributed to it. But then you look at the disclosure path, this alternative solution, this alternative road, and there's research that suggests that this might actually be the better route. Why? Well, for starters, it allows you to control the narrative. You get to explain your disability in your own words, on your own terms. Disclosing also gives you the opportunity to answer any questions your employer might have. This can help avoid any confusion or misunderstandings down the line. And here's something else that's important. Earlier is oftentimes perceived as better than later when it comes to disclosure. It sets the stage for openness and trust right from the get-go. So, having said all this, having taken stock of the literature and employer preferences, I decided personally to do a bit of digging through my research. And what I mean to say is that I explored the story of 18 small business owners, particularly around how they hire handling, what their experiences have been with job candidates or employees with disabilities, what they know or don't know about legal compliance as they scale. And for the sake of today's conversation, what their preferences are for how job candidates should handle disability disclosure with them. Well, many small business owners actually appreciate this honesty. For them, they say, tell me who you are and let me decide if this will work. They believe that being upfront is necessary to protect the trust. After all, honesty is key in any relationship, including, and perhaps more importantly, professional ones. In fact, choosing to disclose can be seen as a reflection of one's character. It shows courage, authenticity, and, as I mentioned before, integrity. As one small business owner put it, there's something special about you. Figure out what it is, lead with that, and drop that all into the conversation that you're having. It's all about positioning. And let's not forget about accommodations. Knowing about a disability allows employers to consider whether and how they can provide the necessary support. In fact, one small business owner said to me, let me know what you can do, let me know what your limitations are, and then let me make a decision on whether it works for me. I'm making an investment in you way more than you're making an investment in me. So for SBOs, these small business owners, it's not just about filling a position. It's about welcoming a new member into their quote unquote family. They want to know more about you and all about you. And when it comes to disclosure, small business owners, SBOs, seem to prefer upfront honesty. Anything that's relevant to the candidate, including their disability, is welcomed early in the process. In fact, in a supplemental survey of 110 SBOs, a significant 67% preferred candidates to discuss their disability and need for accommodations as soon as possible during the interview process. So what's the takeaway? Transparency is ideal. It builds trust, it fosters understanding, and allegedly, it helps create a more inclusive and supportive work environment. But let's take a moment to consider some field evidence that suggests waiting might be the better approach when it comes to disability disclosure, even among small businesses who say that it's all about integrity. Imagine this. Over 6,000 job applications were sent out for accounting positions in a study that I did back in 2018. That's a big number. These were roles where the applicant's disability was unlikely to affect productivity. And for those of you wondering, the disability was revealed in the cover letter, subtly tied to their volunteer work. Oops, excuse me, just lost my position. So the result, there were 26% fewer callbacks for applicants who disclosed. And this gap, get this, was particularly noticeable among small businesses that aren't required to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. So what does this all tell us? While transparency is generally appreciated among SBOs, the timing of disability disclosure can significantly impact the outcome of a job application. Disability disclosure, therefore, is a really, really complex issue. And there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There is no cookbook solution to this question, to this issue. And so in taking this whole understanding, I wanted to level up the complexity. I wanted to kind of appreciate a little bit further how one should disclose. In other words, when and at what point should they disclose? So a study I did where an applicant, Ashley, decided to disclose their invisible disability at different stages of the job interview became the major kind of um, point in us appreciating if whether or not the timing of the disclosure really does matter. Does it affect employability? In the case of early disclosure, it happens right after introductions and expressing interest in the job. Ashley says, quote, "But I also wanted to let you know that I live with a condition which results in chronic pain. Don't get me wrong, I can definitely do my job effectively, but I might need some flexibility in terms of scheduling." Now, on the other hand, with late disclosure, Ashley first discusses their strengths and their strengths and qualifications. Only then do they mention their disability and the need for accommodations. The whole goal was to determine whether the timing of this disclosure could significantly impact the employer's perception and the outcome of the interview. Turns out it did. What we found was that disclosure timing really does influence employer hiring intent. Employability ratings were immediately affected after early disclosure. And while late disclosures weren't rated as negatively, those who opted not to disclose at all still fared much better. Despite their good intentions, these biases could potentially cloud their judgment, which is to say, employers often express a preference for upfront disclosure of disabilities. It's important to be aware that biases, however, may still influence their decision-making process. And so it might just be more beneficial to disclose a disability towards the end of the discussion, which brings me to disability and impression making. For individuals with apparent disabilities, disclosure may not even be necessary, right? It's visible, it's apparent, it's there. Unlike for individuals with invisible disabilities, where they juggle the question, should I, shouldn't I? But in this context, the question becomes, how can they counteract the bias and make a favorable first impression? And this is where we can draw insights from the negotiation literature. It tells us that influence matters. It's about understanding which tactics work and when they work. Now, let's bring this into the context of job interviews and negotiations. We all know first impressions matter, right? But how do we make a good one? It's a tricky beast to tackle. In the kind of linguistics of it all, the way we use language and communicate, right? It's all in the attributions. The way we explain our behavior, our circumstances, has an impression on people. So while the journey might be different for people with disabilities, the destination is practically the same. To make a positive, lasting impression. Enter Bobby. This is an actor we used for a study on disability employment and impression management. And you can see here that in one part of the experiment, Bobby uses a wheelchair while discussing his skills, his background, his qualifications for the job. And in the other scenario, he doesn't use a wheelchair. When asked why Bobby would like the job, Bobby consistently replied, "I've been working alongside a more senior project manager for a few years, so I know what this kind of work requires. And while I enjoyed that job, I'd like to advance into a full project manager role." But in one version, right, of this constant, Bobby emphasizes his hard skills, saying, "My real strength is in my solid math and analytical skills. I'm proficient with all of the current software and data management tools. I'm also highly organized and very detail oriented." So emphasis on hard skills. But in another scenario, Bobby focuses on his soft skills, stating, "My real strength is in my solid interpersonal skills. I'm a good communicator, and I've had success helping people resolve conflicts at work. Overall, I relate really well to people and enjoy motivating them." And what we found between these two manipulations was that curating the interview for hard skills seems to be really beneficial for people with disabilities. For applicants without a disability, both hard skills and soft skills have a positive effect, which is to say, showcasing both technical skills and interpersonal skills was favorably perceived among employers. However, for applicants with a disability, the story was slightly different. Hard skills still had a positive effect, but soft skills didn't seem to make a significant difference. And so, what does this all tell us? It suggests that those with a disability, right, for those individuals, there's a bias when applicants get hired based on their hard skills rather than their soft skills, unlike the scenario for those without disabilities. And the takeaway here being that we need to work with this instinct, right? If you're an applicant with a disability, lean into your hard skills, showcase your technical abilities and expertise, because it's about playing to your strengths and making a positive impression. Despite the perceptions of, say, for example, people with disabilities not having the soft skills in interacting with clientele, with managers, etc., work with that, leverage that to your advantage. In continuing this research on disability employment and impression making, I performed another field study auditing 12,032 firms across the US with hypothetical applicants with and without disabilities to see, okay, does this matter? Does making such an impression matter? Do certain things that we present have an effect on those individuals that are set observers, right? Judges, in kind of allowing us to then take part in gainful employment opportunities. So diving into something intriguing that emerged into our study, when you look at these frequency counts, we see that applicants with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, have the highest callback rates for interviews, and surprisingly, even higher than applicants without disabilities. Again, speaking to the impression that certain types of qualities of oneself give. In the former being hard skills, soft skills, how we go about exercising certain traits of ours. In the spoken word, in this case, it's not even a matter of speaking of anything other than saying, I live with this type of disability. At first, this had me scratching my head, but then a thought struck me. Could PTSD be signaling something more than just a disability? And here's the twist. I never mentioned that these particular applicants were also veterans, right? So could the impression that PTSD gave have influenced these results? It's a fascinating question, and one that underscores the complexity of the hiring process. So I decided to dive deeper into these findings and audited yet another 6,000 companies with applicants who discussed a disability and veteran status, right? In speaking to this idea of impression making and impression management. And here are the key results. Whenever applicants with disabilities disclose their veteran status, their employability ratings, I should say, saw a significant increase. This finding was also supported by a lab experiment. And in that experiment, it was observed that disclosing disability, whether early or late in the process, along with disclosing veteran status, improved employability ratings compared to just disclosing disability alone. And what this suggests is that being a veteran can provide protective benefits for applicants. It's like having an extra shield in this entire hiring process, right? This entire hiring scheme. But that's not to say that we should all join the army, right? I mean, what I'm really getting at here is how one thoughtfully curates their impression making, just like in the previous example with Bobby, in any given employment context can be additive, right? Not subtractive. And this is also true of how we even make accommodation requests. Accommodations are vital for protecting equal access, as many of you know, and increasing the employment of people with disabilities. However, the evidence on whether employers are even willing or perhaps resistant to providing accommodations is mixed. So my co-authors and I explored reactions to accommodations specifically associated with assistive technology, or AT for short, which is really to argue that although the presence of such a device should reassure hiring managers about the abilities of the candidate to do the job, they also risk raising new questions and uncertainties. And what I mean to say is AT, assistive technology, can solve technical problems. We know less about the impression that they give, especially among employers. So on the positive side, technology is generally perceived as a savior, right? A problem solver, a means to an end. And this is kind of according to the machine heuristic model. On the negative side, assistive technology, AT, could also be a signal of concern for employers, leading to resistance, a generalized fear of technology that we have may limit how much people can accept it as a solution to their problem, let's just say. So in a lab study, I had participants with hiring experience review a job description for a position as a pharmacy stock clerk, okay, which included qualifications such as being able to lift objects overhead, as well as uh, undergo tasks like assisting pharmacy personnel, rotating inventory, checking in vendors, and a variety of other related tasks. After reviewing the job description, the participants viewed a section of the fictitious job applicant's resume, which included 3 years of background experience working in a grocery store as a cashier and a stalker, and having had volunteer experience in a local food bank. And then this was followed by 2 photos of the candidate wearing the device while performing a task. Now, just to give you some context, this is called the Picasso, and currently part of a major NSF grant where through this very interdisciplinary approach, we have engineers who specialize in robotics, ourselves who specialize in disability employment, work together in trying to see the value proposition of such a device that helps control for upper body mobility constraints. And what the results show is that when it comes to disability and the use of this device, applicants were seen as more trustworthy, but also perceived as riskier compared to those with a disability, but no device. And so the takeaway is honesty is really appreciated. Thank you for disclosing your need for accommodations, the use of the device, your disability overall, but there's still a sense of risk that employers feel. Now, when disability and accommodations come into play, applicants were rated as less employable and riskier compared to those with a disability, but no accommodations necessary, right? So the conclusion here being that accommodations can be intimidating to employers, which aligns with a lot of the previous findings in previous literature. And finally, when applicants with a disability used extra language, either technical or enthusiastic, to explain away the device, right, to kind of offer reassurance, they were rated as less employable and riskier compared to those with a disability who offered no extra language. And so, what this goes to show is that extra language seemed to raise concerns instead of alleviating them. It perpetuated the kind of risk factor of having assistive technology help protect your productivity and performance, and perhaps even mitigate the stigma tied to disability as it relates to accommodation costs. So diving deeper into this kind of whole study, the qualitative segment, that is to say, participants were asked about what they thought of the device in general. What is your perception of the Picasso? And reactions were split. There were some that were positive, with individuals expressing admiration and compassion. I remember one respondent was really impressed by the use of this device. Others found it incredibly cool. But on the flip side, there were also negative responses, right? Some individuals found the device uncomfortable and obtrusive. They were worried more so about how customers would even react to something like this. There were concerns about it being a potential liability and causing discomfort among coworkers and just amongst people in general who are kind of within the sphere of the Picasso in use. The major point being that there's this kind of growing awareness about the importance of disability hiring and accommodations. But despite that, employers still express hesitation, right? Which is to say that there's more work that needs to be done to understand how we can go about reassuring them, how we can go about placating these concerns. So, this new study that I've undergone, which is currently a work in progress, basically looks at how we can introduce the device, but also offer opportunities for us to onboard ourselves more seamlessly through perhaps a job trial, maybe letters of reference from previous employers who have seen this device in action on the shop floor. and more. Now, as a final aspect of impression making, I want to address something that's perhaps the most relatable: self-advocacy. Self-advocacy refers to the ability of people with disabilities to speak up for themselves diplomatically, tactfully, um, in this case at work, about their needs. It's really a means to a bigger end, gainful employment, right? To protect their productivity, to protect their performance, but to kind of get their foot in the door and keep it there. And there's a element to this, which is to say, um, a skill to this that most of us don't know how to practice. And I'm going to get to this in a moment, unpacking this just a little bit further. But really, the argument is that there are elements to possessing this skill that includes being self-aware, right? Knowing your rights, being able to communicate those rights persuasively and assertively, but also practice active listening and leadership, which is to really argue being resourceful on self, making this whole disability employment experience a success. This is really what it means for true job preparedness. And like I said before, gainful employment. Knowing that self-advocacy is an area that exists, and that there are training curricula perhaps out there in the world, and knowing how powerful it is of a tool to assert oneself and to kind of protect one's needs, the stigma tied to disability precludes people from wanting to assert themselves this way, because they're concerned about the impression that it gives to speak up for oneself. So, in having said all that, I performed just recently a study among students and alumni with disabilities to explore why. In the context of job hunting, there's often a perception that disabilities are undesirable, right? That they should be hidden. Practically, this entire talk at the front end speaks to that point. And having kind of met with students and alumni with disabilities about this area of concern, given the fact that they're in an incubator of sorts in learning how to, in life generally, self-advocate, disability notwithstanding, this can lead to what participants describe, this concern, given the stigma, as silently suffering, enduring difficulties without voicing them, right? All to avoid potential rejection in the field when it counts the most. So the fear of exclusion is tangible, it's real, and it drives many to adopt the mantra, fake it till you make it, right? This means they might cultivate a non-disabled persona during job interviews, doing whatever it takes to make a good impression and secure the job. And this pain point is even worse for individuals that I've met with multiple marginalized identities. In fact, among participants who were disabled, women of color, women in general, there was a concern about the double or triple or even quadruple bind that exists in their world, in their lives. Consider the experience of women with disabilities. They've shared how societal gender norms often complicate their efforts to assert their rights. It's a delicate balance, so to speak, standing up for oneself without being labeled as difficult, right? And this brings us to a critical question. At what point does self-advocacy cross the line and become perceived as being a nuisance? It's a very thought-provoking question that participants kind of brought to my attention and had me wondering, right? But what's even more thought-provoking is what higher education is doing about it, right? We're building brilliant students who hold advanced degrees in STEM, in business, or otherwise. And yet, for students with disabilities, they're not able to fly the nest as prepared as they should be to communicate their needs and apply their skills without discrepancy. And what I mean to say is that programmatic support seems to be lacking, which perpetuates the stigma. Correct me if I'm wrong. So for participants in my study, career services in the context of disability employment training curricula was perceived as nebulous, non-existent, absent, and more. Some felt like it was a matter of being thrown to the wolves to figure it out on their own. I also remember vividly a participant who lived with traumatic brain injury, with a STEM degree, no less, arguing that they opted to become a logistics mover because they couldn't just walk off the podium and go into any job within the field that they were trained for academically, right, without incurring backlash, or better yet, ending up without the job. They just didn't have the right skills to do it masterfully, confidently, in the interest of self-advocacy. In fact, among participants, my alumni in particular, this crossover to employment was described as a baptism by fire. And so what's the solution, having said all that? Within higher education, we need to enhance the support provided by university programs for our people with disabilities, for our students with disabilities, right? This will absolutely help ensure a smoother transition into the professional realm, into the professional domain. By implementing the self-advocacy model in our training curricula, we have the ability to empower individuals so they're not just surviving the transition, as evidenced by my participants in this particular study, but truly thriving in the working world. And that's the North Star, right? Above all, regardless of these studies that I've introduced on leaning on this instinct or disclosing at this time, et cetera, this could be coined as the kind of true game changer. Now, we've spent some time talking only about the employee side of things, but very quickly, I want to consider the other path forward, which is to say employer behavior. Let's talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, namely the marketing that companies undergo to demonstrate that they're DEI forward, DEI centric, that they're all things DEI. Sometimes there's a gap, and I say this respectfully, between what companies say in their marketing and what they actually do. This disconnect sends mixed messages. Companies need to understand that what they present online doesn't always translate to their on-site reality. It's just not enough to talk the talk per se. Nobody likes to be called a hypocrite, right? So it's crucial for companies to walk the walk and ensure their actions align with their words. And so how companies improve disability inclusion is really the kind of question that needs to be determined, right? Answered. And so in a study with my co-author, we found that sincere statements and prominent use of DEI language can inspire positive reactions from job applicants. And trust plays a crucial role in these positive relationships. That is the kind of vehicle, the mechanism per se. However, there's a flip side to this story. Some people, right, at least amongst our participants, were largely skeptical. Right? They worry that despite the inclusive language, bias might still exist in the actual job environment, notwithstanding. Without concrete evidence, objective evidence, there can be doubts about whether the company's actions will match their words. So what's the takeaway? A comprehensive DEI strategy is more than just responding to the current conversation. Right? It's about creating conditions for lasting behavioral change. It's about walking the talk, not just today, but literally every single day. And that brings me to the 5 stages of DEI maturity. In order to do the every single day, companies have to possess a mature DEI platform. So in wrapping up our talk today, I want to share the 5 stages with you that's been outlined in the literature. The first stage is for companies to be aware, which is oftentimes triggered by events like lawsuits, being called out by investors, even a traumatic incident. Subsequently, we have the compliance stage. And here, the mindset is we do DEI because we have to, often driven by, as I've mentioned, laws like the US Employment EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Then we move to the tactical stage. This is where companies start to think beyond compliance and set more ambitious goals. This is where they kind of be more intentional with the approach. It's often characterized by a decentralized type of strategy with employees or managers leading those DEI efforts, whether those are ERGs, community guidelines that are created in a very community-driven fashion. You'll see things like those occur, which really does allow for companies to get more tactical with the entire strategy. The 4th stage is then to be integrated. At this point, there are systems in place to ensure that DEI is literally part of everything you do, from hiring to training and development, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone in this case can fully contribute to the conversation. And whether that's by way of decision making, that's been decentralized, teaming, talent acquisition, all of this starts to have a hint of DEI embedded. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, you reach the sustainability stage. And this is where companies pass that stress test, whether by recession, leadership changes, something relevant to the DEI rhetoric still kind of remains. The status quo on DEI remains as is, if not galvanized, despite those types of changes that might occur that would otherwise impede DEI from being front and center as far as agenda setting is concerned. So only by mastering this comprehensive DEI strategy can we create conditions for lasting behavioral change where issues of disability disclosure and much of what I've discussed today aren't such an issue of concern. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for the time that you've taken out to appreciate the lessons, the insights, our findings in the literature, findings that I have done personally, or rather research that I've done and findings that I'm able to share. I'm now going to kind of put the mic to Margaret for Q&A.
Thank you, Mason. That was fantastic and very, very informative. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, and I have a couple myself if we have a little time too. I'm going to begin with the first question that had come in, and it was near the front end of your presentation. And it said, how can we improve the morale of people with disabilities to make them work effectively?
I think morale is attributed to what you signal as a company in building community. Culture matters. There's a lovely saying out there in the business world that culture eats strategy for breakfast. How people feel in terms of quote unquote, this is how we do it, in the interest of accessibility, disability employment really does have an effect on morale, on people having a stronger sense of belonging, in wanting to invest themselves well beyond the job description and be a true citizen of the organization. And it all stems from culture. So saying that you are DEI forward, having a DEI agenda that's strictly superficial is not enough. It is not enough to be kind of on the bandwagon. You've got to do more, you've got to do different, and it's got to be very much centered around your organization and how you personally operate. So it's idiosyncratic to that end. Morale to me is a means to a greater end. To be truly part of that quote unquote family, as those SBOs had mentioned, is a major lift. And that lift is directly tied to execs, middle managers, people such as ourselves that are working co-located with people with disabilities, employees with disabilities, to collaborate and really understand the lived experience of people with disabilities. In building that environment subsequently, we've got to kind of take the temperature. That's one major way in building morale.
I think that's great. And by saying one major reason, I realize that there will be more to follow. Like, you know, there's definitely complexities as you've stated already. Our next question comes from someone who is in the healthcare profession, and she asks, what resources would you recommend for those who want to continue their education on accessibility measures?
That's a really good question. I mentioned earlier on training curricula in higher education, but I believe even this training curricula can exist within the work site, within the work environment, within organizations. We have ERGs that exist across every organization nowadays, addressing one group or another, or the intersections of many groups or many issues that have existed for a time. And I think that's an excellent space where such training curricula can be housed. But above all, I still believe very much that it should be something formal, something centralized, something top down, where we are constantly sharpening our minds and awareness to undo aversion on accessibility. Um, think to remote work. Right? We moved heaven and earth to make it a success for every single person in a very universal type of approach. And yet, people with disabilities for a time prior to the pandemic were calling for telework. At that time, it was called telework, to be part of the scheme in reasonable accommodations being granted. And they were denied more often than not. And so I believe that when it comes to true access, we've got to, again, take stock of the not just the lived experience of people without disabilities, but also the lived experience of people with disabilities. Because then it allows us for kind of strategy change to build inroads and relationships with a vast amount of human resources that are among people with disabilities, and to just create a more universal space where accessibility isn't such a scary topic to bring up, to broach, and to negotiate over. It should just exist, period end. Which is why I'd like to believe that remote work hasn't been done away with, that the RTO rhetoric hasn't been as successful as it was once believed to kind of become. Um, and yeah, I believe that's the way to go. Training curricula, more exposure on what access really means.
That's great. And my own interactions with ERGs is that they are sometimes as much as half populated by allies. So someone who's in a healthcare profession, not possessing a disability themselves, could still be an ally in their
Oh yeah,
organization's ERG. Yeah. We
absolutely,
had
absolutely.
we had another question just come in, and I think this is a great one. Are there certain industries that have greater success with accommodating disabled workers?
That is a question I don't have an answer to right offhand. But this sort of information, if it's publicly available, which oftentimes it is through Disability In, who have what's called the Valuable 500, the 500 topmost companies who are tied to their own respective industries that are very much accessible, are all about disability employment, do a tremendous job with disability employment. But off the kind of cuff or right off the bat, I can't name any one industry right now at the moment. No.
It makes me curious, and I don't know the answer to this question, but I wonder if information about accommodations and things are available on things like Glassdoor, you know, when you're
It
looking at
certainly there are
unemployed.
certain databases, right? There are certain databases out there that will give you that type of insight. Of course, there's always hearsay evidence, where people will say this particular industry is way more disability friendly than otherwise that industry. But I'd rather lean on the databases that come from legitimate platforms such as the NOD, the National Organization on Disability, Disability In, other advocacy groups, companies themselves on their DEI websites, platforms on Access who offer testimonials and statistics, and that might speak largely to the industry itself.
Yeah, interesting. Great. Well, to our audience, we can continue to monitor the Q&A box for additional questions. And while we're waiting for anyone else to type in, is it okay if I ask my couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Um, so uh, I saw your slide and was particularly intrigued because of the other work that I do for Rutgers Business School with veterans about the veterans with disabilities, and wondered how gender played into that because I noticed that you happen to have used female veterans in the study.
Yeah, so currently this study is under review. And basically, we were trying to hone in on the intersectionality rhetoric, because clearly people don't just live with a disability and are defined by strictly that, right? I am someone who has a variety of characteristics, aspects of myself that make me me, much like yourselves. Um, and so, in having said all that, we looked at disability as it relates to veteran status in this case and gender. We don't really find strong gender effects. Um, but what we find is that veteran status does mitigate the backlash of disability and gender individually and collectively. right? So in isolating any which one of these variables between disability and gender, um, we do see some evidence of discrimination for gender. It's not strong enough. But when you intersect these two variables alongside veteran status, it seems to be the case that veteran status really does have a strong positive effect on employability ratings, which is really telling of what, in the interest of impression making and impression management, do we have, do we live with that really does signal something positive or negative? And of the positive, can we leverage that to the utmost in the interest of, again, employment opportunities?
Fascinating. I will definitely be keeping an eye on that and sharing as those additional results get published. Um, One other question that I have was uh, sometimes a disability is something that you're born with, and sometimes it's something that's acquired. Did you look into if there were any differences with acquired versus congenital?
Yeah, so disability onset is the question you're asking. And no, in the context of my field experiments, we never disclosed disability onset. Um, though I will say that in my recent study on self-advocacy, I met with many participants, students and alumni respectively, from universities who shared with me that their disability onset was much later in life, not congenital, and they were able to see the kind of the put it this way, they were able to kind of look at it from two different perspectives. Their now lived experience as someone who lives with a disability, prior to that, their lived experience as someone without a disability. And tangibly, they notice the issues of disability-based disclosure, whether for academic support or for employment support, the issues of broaching the subject in kind of doing away with false perceptions of seizing an unfair advantage over individuals without disabilities. And it's a really difficult issue for them to circumnavigate, get through, cope with, hence the need for self-advocacy training. Um, for the lion's share of my applicants, excuse me, my applicants, forgive me, I'm still stuck in my field studies. My participants, the issue of disability was such that many of them, invisible or otherwise visible, chose never to address it. And that says something, even for the visibly disabled participants, where that kind of precept, fake it till you make it, I'll do what I have to do, brute forcing it. I'm just trying to get an opportunity here for myself. I want to play the game because that's the game. Blending in, per se. It was so mission critical to be able to self-fulfill. But the question really is, are you self-fulfilling? Um, Especially when your disability does potentially affect your productivity. And then you have to go about bringing the subject up. And how do you do that? Tactfully, diplomatically, strategically, that's something that they could not answer. Or when they did, they more or less argued that I just don't know how. And that's when the kind of reactive uh, strategy comes into play. You're bootstrapping a solution, and that solution oftentimes ends up where you may actually lose the job, right? Or lose face, or something even more extreme, God knows. So it is so mission critical. It is so important. It is so past due that higher education implement self-advocacy curricula in their disability employment trainings or employment trainings in general, because it's not just a matter of curating the right resume or simulating and posturing in interviews, again, to make that perfect first impression. Whether you want to kind of lean on your hard skills or soft skills, let's talk shop about the real situation. I live with a disability, right? To be able to say that proudly and to be able to then say, here are my needs, right? That's something we need to work on. It's something that's definitely lacking in university curricula writ large.
Well, we're making strides certainly here with all that you're doing, to get us better positioned for that. And I know I appreciate that. The population of students that I work with when I'm not voicing our webinars, I know appreciates that, and I think it will have long-lasting and far-reaching effects over time. So thank you. Um, so I want to thank you for today's presentation, and just noticed that one more question came in. Do you mind taking one more question before we close out?
Sure,
Okay,
absolutely.
I just noticed that pop in. So, oh, actually, probably more of a comment. She says, "My hope
Hmm.
is that there could be more and ongoing sensitivity training by employers to their staff when it comes to understanding the disabled community."
That's an excellent
Mm.
point. And I think that goes hand in hand with my earlier point on boosting morale. Um, Sensitivity training is a matter of first and foremost appreciating the lives of people with disabilities, appreciating the very term disability, the value proposition of accommodations, as not being perceived as an unfair advantage, but rather in level setting the playing field and helping people kind of perform um, with certain types of accommodations, be it remote work or otherwise something on site. Because we don't want to relegate to the virtual domain and say, ah, we've cracked it, out of sight, out of mind, right? That's not fair. Um, so that sensitivity training in terms of how we go about having this interactive conversation, this interactive process in talking shop on um, disability-based accommodations, flexibility being the through line here is something that absolutely most middle managers are lacking and need to work on. Executives are lacking, need to work on. Employers are lacking, need to work on. Even your coworkers who don't quite understand and have to learn how to understand. Because I'd like to say that DEI seldom ever includes the conversation of disability. It's well past due, right? We need to make that happen. We need to make it such that DEIA, A being accessibility, is part of the rhetoric, part of the conversation, always, always.
Fantastic conclusion. I think that comment put, kind of the bow on the present here. So and with that, Mason, I want to thank you for a very enlightening discussion today, and thank our audience for their great questions that enhance the discussion as well. As we conclude, I just want to make sure that everyone knows the RBS webinars take place monthly on Fridays at noon Eastern. And for more information, you can always visit our webpage, and this will be emailed to all of the registrants. And if anybody's watching, do you want to show that on the screen, Mason, the one with yeah, perfect. Yes, where people can find both our future and our past webinars. We always have an exciting schedule of topics lined up throughout the year, and those are thanks to suggestions from our audience. So the little survey that you'll receive momentarily will provide you an opportunity to answer 3 questions, and one is a free form field where you can type in suggestions for topics for future webinars. And finally, as I mentioned when our webinar began earlier, a link to the archived recording of this presentation will be shared via social media and emailed to you. And it will also be on the Business Insights page of our website, along with the recordings from previous virtual Lunch and Learns. So we'll see you next time. Mason, thank you. Our audience, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.